So thanks to the cooking crew this morning, Craig, Peter, and myself. And we asked for a $6 donation to help cover food costs. And today, from somewhere in Pennsylvania, we have Nancy Weston. And so this is going to take an hour, so maybe we're gonna see how the questions work. We may want you to stand right here in front of this camera so she can hear you. But anyway, Nancy, take it away.
Welcome all of you, and I've been there a number of times with my family. Shanna Weston is my daughter, Josh Raminsky and Anna and Lila. And I've been in that community room there, so it's nice to see you all, and thanks for coming for this. So I'm just going to dive right in, and if you have questions, perhaps you want to save them to the end, because it's going to entail you having to walk up to the, to where it could be heard, because I can't really hear people that well from the back. All right, so let me just make sure I'm getting this correct here. How do I forward it? Here we go. Okay. I'm going to need to collapse. I can't actually see my screen, unfortunately, all my notes, because of the people in, I think Jeff or John, whoever's here, and thank you both for setting this up. I just needed to hide. There we go. I needed to hide the pictures of people so that I could see my presenter notes. Okay, so this presentation is a result, and I've actually done this at my own church. It's the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Lehigh Valley, and I've done it at several quilt guilds. What happened was I visited the New England Quilt Museum in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is really not far from you all. And the museum had a special exhibit. This was in 2017, responding to the election of Donald Trump as president. So I was really intrigued by it, because I'm both a quilter and an activist. I'm the chair of the Social Justice Committee at my church. So I was inspired to research quilting as a form of social protest. Sometimes it's called craftivism, and you'll find that many of these quilts and their messages are controversial. And when I have done this for other places like my quilt guilds and things like that, I have actually taken out some of the slides, and I have mentioned to people that if they find the issues controversial, that they just focus on the quilting as art. But we don't really have to worry about that with Unitarian Universalism. I'm sure none of you will object to it, whatever messages are in the quilt. All right, so starting, this is Jessica Schulte. She lives near me in Easton. I'm in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. She made these two quilts for the Women's March, which was in 2017. I actually went to that in DC. I did not make a quilt. Never even occurred to me make a quilt, but she made these two quilts, which were carried in the march. She's a modern quilter. Her work does not look antique-y at all. It's made with bright colors and big, bold words and things like that. So these are some other quilts that were shown at one of them is also Jessica's, America is Already Great. And then the other one was someone had woven together strips of cloth, a quilter had, and carried this in the Women's March. So this is an actual sign that was carried. So activist quilting actually speaks for people who are oppressed, repressed, underrepresented, and unrepresented. That's why Jessica says America is already great. And another quilter weaves together the strips of the strips of fabric of many colors, because that is, according to activist belief and Unitarian Universalists too, that it's the variety of people that we embrace and are that actually represents our values. So craftivism is someone who channels their anger at the injustice in the world and their passion for a better world into creative objects and activities. So this quote comes from a book called Quilts and Human Rights. Craftivists are doing what they do to rally, to educate and inspire, to entertain, to heal, but most of all to tell the story, the hidden story, the story denied. For some individuals, their needlework skills have provided their only accessible and affordable means to express their feelings, their values, and experiences. It's no wonder then the textiles have been used by so many to reflect upon, document, and motivate action related to societal issues. A couple of more banners from the Women's March. Patriotic resisting, and there's that famous pink pussy hat, which there's a section in my presentation which talks about that a little bit later. And you can also see some of the other creative banners that were done for the Women's March. So that's what motivated me to find out about this exhibit. And this is the actual book, a picture of the book that was presented by the Lowell Quilt Museum. And the name of the exhibition was Threads of Resistance, a juried exhibition to protest the Trump administration's actions and policies. So through a lot of history, quilts have spoken to a lot of different political causes. The results of the 2017 presidential election activated a lot of fiber artists who saw in the Trump administration an assault on the climate, immigrants, women, refugees, race, and many other issues. So the art in this exhibition communicated a range of emotions from anger to sadness and to hope for positive change. So the beginning of the slide presentation is actually pictures that I took at the Lowell Quilt Museum. First 100 days filled Jamie with pure outrage, and that's boldly represented by the words and deeds, counteracting fake news and alternative facts. Alice Beasley shows us feeding time at the swamp. In her view, instead of draining the swamp, the alligator-in-chief has staffed his administration with billionaires and Wall Streeters, all practiced at feeding off the other 99%. Mill's piece, Resistance, describes the movement to get Trump's administration's attention through marches, protests, letters, calls, emails, and tweets. She ultimately decides that the one best way to get attention is through money. You can see all of the dollar bills creating. And it's really amazing how these quilters incorporated materials into their quilts. Martha Wolf's Privileged Times was inspired by the quote, "Privilege is when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally." This artist represents those in power as living in privileged times, and you can see across the newspaper columns below the words quilted in, white, affluent, Christian, heterosexual, cisgender, and male. You know, I know these look like photographs almost, but remember they're all made of fiber arts. Here's another one. This looks like a drawing almost, but again, it's made from pieces of fabric. So in this one, Chasm, Sandra Poteet illustrates the gap between the rich and the poor, how it continues to widen due to the advancement of policies that favor the privileged and the wealthy. Her words embroidered at the top say, "How does trickle work down again? Well, first, 1% get all the money. Any questions?" This quilt, of course, is now dated because it was made prior to the downfall of Roe versus Wade, but it is concerned with a woman's right to choose. The hanger represents the dire threat to women if they no longer have control over their bodies. The stark red symbolizes the blood that will be shed if women must rely on illegal and unsafe abortions once again. A lot of these quilts have words and images in the background which make them different from what you think of probably as traditional quilting bed quilts that are pieced with little squares or triangles. Sarah, the quilter represented here, saw a political comic in which a man says, "Government should be small and unobtrusive so women don't feel it in their uteruses." She created this quilt in response to show men fighting over the right to control reproductive rights. The background is a warning. Those are all supposed to represent women's genitalia, and they should not fall into rank and file, which is why they're all lined up in rows. That's a warning.
Yeah, right.
Barbara Brandon experienced many things said by President Trump as lies. The figure in the center is created from images from stamps and coins that represent our country. I don't know how clearly you can see the detail, but that's the image in the center that is represented. It represents Trump and is created from the stamps and coins. Unplugged by Kelly Perkins. She believes that much of the media has abandoned truth for the far more colorful and enticing lies, which, although they look bright and cheerful, are all tangled up and knotted, causing us to be cut off from reality. And you can see in the background there of the quilt, well, it's actually the words say lies, lies, lies up here, and then the plugged into the truth, the cord that is going from the television to truth is cut. Representing the Trump administration's ties to the fossil fuel industry, Gusher signifies the damage done to the environment by our addiction to consumerism and our reliance on oil-based products. So I've put in the detail there, the figure is actually excreting red plastic Solo cups, which of course, a byproduct of the oil industry. Sylvia Hernandez feels that the Trump administration has shown little leadership in environmental causes. In this case, fixing the poisoned water system in Michigan. The words in Spanish represent the fact that immigrant families without IDs were not given bottled water by the government. So these quilts have become a teaching tool as well as an artistic expression. We learned some things that we didn't know. The Dakota Access Pipeline became a rallying cry for many who saw yet again Native Americans and their land being endangered and disrespected. Like the many tears of the Native peoples over the years, the oil will flow, polluting the blue waters with its black leaks. Death of science, sorry. Phyllis Cullen expresses her dismay at the Trump administration's ignorance of the role that science plays in policy. And of course, this quilt was created prior to COVID-19. Note the barring of the research lab and the screw protruding from the dead scientists, signifying that we are all truly screwed by the mistrust in science. This is interesting. I put the detail in here so that you can see that this Capitol building is actually made up completely of images of guns and ammunition. And perhaps no other issue has engaged as many quilters who do social justice protest quilting than guns. So this artist joined Moms Demand Action after a local youth was shot and killed at a university. In spite of all these mass shootings, and of course there have been many more since this show in 2017, Congress has made very little progress in addressing the gun violence epidemic in our culture. Another one representing the quilter's concern about gun violence. Rebecca Fellows asks why. Again, remember that although these look like paintings or drawings, they're actually made out of fiber. And sometimes quilt artists will actually paint on their work, but they're still using a lot of fiber. So this one is another piece addressing the proliferation of guns. Sheila Rice believes that the justice system is unbalanced when dealing with the issue of gun control, which is why the woman in this figure is holding the balance scales. All rights go to the gun owners, represented by the bullets weighing down the scales, and by big money activists, which you can see in the background behind the figure, the money. And this one I put a little detail to show you the quilting detail. Now the quilting detail is done with thread that goes over on top once the quilt is finished, layering the three layers together. But you can see how much quilting is done to create that detail. So about couple of years later, the Lowell Quilt Museum had another exhibit, and this one was on basically on guns. So the ones you saw before were part of the exhibit that was in 2017. 2021, they did another one called Guns, Loaded Conversations. And this one first image here is from Kelly Burke's reimagined American flag series, Don't Lives Matter. So she's trying to point out the enormous divide that exists between people who cherish gun ownership and those who are concerned about the proliferation of guns, which actually has become a health crisis and an epidemic in the United States. Another one, the left quilt is called American Opportunity. It's a meditation to the victims of the Las Vegas shooting. There are over 500 burned and numbered holes representing the victims, with X's standing for the 58 people who died. And the stitching represents the chaotic paths of the crowd as they began to flee. Red fabric underneath, showing through the holes, is the blood shed. The quilter says, it took me longer to do the burning, stitching, and numbering than it took the shooter to mow down the concert goers. On the right, that quilt is entitled One Pulse, which commemorates the shooting of 99 with 49 left dead in an LGBTQ nightclub in Florida, where the safe space was violated in 2016. Another flag, this one was created after Sandy Hook, which I might mention, I lived in Connecticut at the time, right next door to Sandy Hook, and I marched on the Capitol a few months after Sandy Hook. And Connecticut, there were 5,000 people there. We actually were effective in getting the gun laws in Connecticut changed. This one expresses how creative quilters can be. This particular quilter in the left quilt, you'll see there are ammo strips. And at the very bottom, those are cadaver toe tags. The quilt on the right has bullets and clips. So the one on the right would be an example of fabric that was dyed to express a certain feeling, in this case, a lot of chaos, I think. So this one is on purpose supposed to look really raggedy because it represents a dirty asphalt street. And if you look in the background, you'll see an outline of a figure, a chalk outline. All around it are holes left by bullets. People in other countries think America means gun. And in this design, the point of a gun bleeds over the word America. And it states, if guns made us safe, then America would be the safest country in the world. A lot of the quilts use this imagery of target practice, ready, aim, fire. And then the one on the far right, Ma and Pa get radicalized in Oregon. Another one to represent the bullseye. Sean Kimber taught for quite a while in a college near me, Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. She was a professor of mathematics there. There's a couple of other quilts later in the show by her. But she was using that theme again, bullseye. And a different artist, which I'm sorry I don't have the name of. This one is, those are laid out so that it looks as though they might be coffins or shrouds for people who have died from gun violence, but they're also shaped like bullets. You know, the creativity is really astounding when you think of all the different ways to represent the same issue. So this quilter used embroidery to create a sharp contrast. The embroidery I've shown you in the right side. So you can see the embroidered in gold, the types of guns used during the late 1700s and the guns used today in mass shootings. And on the left, each thread is anchored into a brass casing which signify the number of mass shootings in one American city. This one looks much more simple. And, children are, of course, victims of gun violence, not only because they're being shot, but because they're finding unsecured guns. So Claire's quilt on the left is from the viewpoint of a 4-year-old. And if you can see the background, there's a detail there. Dozens of children are in trapunto, which is a quilting technique where the quilting is done and then it's stuffed from the back to make it stand out a little bit 3D-ish. And then on the right, Joan Nicholson's quilt expresses that at some point, one of us could be the next person sitting, staring at an empty chair when a loved one has been a victim of gun violence. Every other day, how many days go by without gunfire? Actually, none. And on the right side, again, showing an artist's really creative use of materials. That's a quilt made completely of empty lead magnum shot bags, known as ammo bags. This quilter's husband worked in the Chicago school system, where many school children are victims of gun violence. And then the ironic piece on the right is an embroidered gun contrasted against the delicate lady's handkerchief. This quilter's nephew was a Sandy Hook first grader when the massacre of the 26 children and staff occurred, and one of his best friends was killed. The background, which is cut into 26 pieces radiating out from the center, you can actually see the lines where they're cut, is a news article printed on fabric depicting the tragedy, and the balloons of hope create a sense that we can move beyond this. This artist said that after the shootings at Sandy Hook, she expected significant changes in gun control laws. And she says, I was dumbfounded when attempts to tighten these laws could not pass Congress. And so for this piece, I created the most shocking image I could think of to express my horror at the school shootings and my disappointment in our government. It is based on Marc Chagall's White Crucifixion. Similarly, the quilt on the left on purpose was created by the quilter to show a cross created from 3 different guns to suggest the quilter's belief that there is a worship of guns in this culture as sacred. And again, if you look at the background there are quilted coffins. And of course, the red blood. On the right, particularly American Horror, was a reflection of the 2017 gun rampage in Las Vegas that took the lives of 58 victims and left countless others scarred. She says, I fear that we will never confront the horror of gun violence, and I pray that we will find a solution. The community I live in here, 55 plus, has an artist who is actually very well known, a fiber artist, Barbara Schulman. She's an MFA and a former Kutztown, Pennsylvania University professor emeritus. She creates multimedia collages based on issues she's passionate about, and this is her interpretation of the plague of gun violence in America. Again, note the creative use of other objects besides fabric. There are guns with a stop sign through them that are the arms. And again, this also looks like a cross, the idea of a crucifixion in a sense of so many people by gun violence. So, of course, gun violence is a huge issue, but there are many others. This quilt artist sees a heightened assault on people of color, women, the poor, education. science, facts, media, environment, personal freedoms, which is represented by the burning of the crosses. So this particular artist used imagery from the Ku Klux Klan, and Miss Liberty is actually hung on the cross, being persecuted by the Ku Klux Klan. Throughout history, people have been forced to flee from their homes for their own safety and survival due to war, oppression, natural disasters, atrocious human rights violations. The refugee crisis is an enormous problem all over the world, and that is being highlighted by these quilts. In Do Palma's piece, we see wanderers boxed in by our country's immigration policies. This artist expresses her frustration that the U.S. refuses to settle refugees. Of course, that's not true everywhere, but a lot of the policies are that way. These quilters ask, don't refugees and migrants just want what we do? I hope you're getting a sense of how incredibly creative all of these different ways of looking at these issues are expressed. This is amazing. This was created with the matrix technique, which means that 500 individual 2-inch squares of fabric were dyed and shaped to create parts of this young girl's face. And there's a detail there, so you can see the layering of the fabric. These two women ask, these two artists ask, what does an American look like? This is a portrait of a Japanese American woman speaking to the plight of the 120,000 others who were incarcerated in U.S. prison camps during World War II. And again, here the detail, you can see how the artist has used words like prejudice, yellow face, melting pot, and internment. Those are all worked in. So you have to get up really close to a piece like this to be able to see the fine details. So this piece actually has hundreds and hundreds of words created into the fabric. Not normal reminds us that, like Orwell's 1984, we live in times where lies and misinformation are commonplace, and tearing down the establishment is seen as progress. Look closely to see the faint orange word not. See, it says this is normal, but if you look closely in between the blue, you'll see in orange not. This is not normal. This quilt was actually created by my sister, who's also a quilter. And in response to Trump's constant emphasis on fake news, she called this not fake news. And you can actually see this fabric is printed with headlines from various newspapers. Like in this case, it says Nixon resigns right here. Well, of course, you all know about the attack on so-called wokeism that is happening all over the country. A good example being Florida. So it's used by progressive and liberals to suggest, at least this is according to the conservatives, to suggest that people need to put their attention on these issues of white privilege and oppression. It was originally used by the Black Lives Matter movement, but now it's an infamous phrase in the culture wars. Now, this next slide is not a quilt, but it's so cute. This is a little boy from the Women's March. Yeah, I love naps, but I stay woke. So this little child reminding us that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. This rainbow flag quilt represents that the LGBTQIA community has rights also. Another quilt with the theme of equality. This woman quilter discovered while doing research for her piece that our Constitution does not have the protection of the Equal Rights Amendment. So again, you know, when these quilters are doing the research necessary to produce what they want to, it's an education. No, these quilts are an education to see them, but also making the quilts is an education often for people. So another quilt show I attended was in North Carolina, and these were some submissions that were well submitted to the Lowell Quilt Museum for the 2017 threads of I can't remember the word, threads of protest, whatever it was. But these were not ones that were accepted by the show. So they were in the North Carolina Quilt Guild show. This one is kind of cool because there's that line of the little pink pussy hats at the top bordering the quilt. This was the artist representation of the women's rally on the same date that the one took place in Washington. She thought that she was going to be the only one to show up because it was raining and it was a deeply red state, but she was so inspired because thousands of women marched. So this is a very different technique. It looks like a quilt from a distance, but if you get up close, it's actually a hooked piece. And that's why I gave you the detail there, so you can see all the little loops of fabric that actually create the quilt. You can see around it, it says, the Women's March on Washington trumped the inauguration, which is true. Another one, here are the women's marchers, and in the background in the blue are words that come from the preamble to the Constitution and the first four freedoms, and the four freedoms in the First Amendment. So she has done that needlework, handwork in the background there. This one's incredible. Look at the detail first, because those are 1/2-inch squares, okay? Each one of those represents 325 people of all colors who marched, bound together by one symbol gone viral, created by one woman knitter who took back a word meant to humiliate women, but instead became a powerful icon. This technique is called felting. And again, not your traditional quilt. And you certainly wouldn't put it on a bed. It's a work of art. But woven into the background, which is very hard to see in this slide, are words like love, truth, resist, and others. Same theme, different interpretation. Here you can see Washington, D.C. In the background, and then in the foreground, again, the pink pussy hat made up of many tiny pink pussy hats, representing the Democratic overlay when the marchers protested. So, persistence. Women have been told for ages to shut up and sit down. Betty Busby reminds us that women's voices have taken a severe hit by reactionary forces in the U.S. And of course, if you live in Massachusetts, which most of you I assume do, your Senator, Elizabeth Warren, nevertheless, she persisted. This recalls the moment when the quilter's senator was reading a letter by Loretta Scott King on the Senate floor, and she was silenced by the Speaker, Mitch McConnell, who said she was warned, she was given an explanation, nevertheless, she persisted. And so this really became a rallying cry for protesters, particularly women. Again, if you can only imagine the detail it takes to create something like that. If you were going to a quilt show and could see these, you could get up close and really see how much work goes into these. Nevertheless, they persisted. We already had another quilt by Do Palma, but this quilt shows images of people like Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, Eleanor Roosevelt, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Betty Friedan, and they're superimposed on fabric with the names of dozens of persistent women. Again, the detail, you can see at least the words in the background, even though you can't read the names of the women. uppity women climbing the ladder. The cornerstone blocks below commemorate the original suffragettes. Woven ribbons are embroidered with the names of women throughout the centuries who persisted. So again, you can't really see the names unless you get close up. But the theme suggests that one thread alone can easily be broken, but woven fabric of many threads together is so much stronger. Amy Sullivan says, in the words of Teddy Roosevelt, patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president. Again, this flag is made up of detail of many squares of different colors, little tiny squares there. This quilter says, I pledge not allegiance, but I pledge vigilance and resistance. What would the flag look like today if Betsy Ross made it today? Mary Bolton says it wouldn't be so neat. It would have many colors and it would be tattered to represent the struggles needed to preserve democracy. Sometimes we need to unravel an unjust system before we can sew it back together. Injustices are messy and tangled up as threads, and we need to see how they're connected before we can tease them apart. Working together makes it easier. So this is actually on a background of like burlap are all of these tangled threads, but you can see there are some words in there. All right, so something that was really interesting that quilters do are collaborative quilt art movements. One of the first was the Boise, Idaho, when a church woman heard a Utah woman describing the devastating effect of nuclear tests in the desert near her town in the 1950s. She said to her friends, someone ought to do something. And her friend Diane said, well, why don't we? So they decided to make a patchwork quilt, which they would send directly to the Soviet Union as a gesture of friendship. Ironically, neither woman had ever quilted before. The Boise Quilt Project grew into quite an endeavor, and a lot of other quilt projects around the country were started as a result of this. So these are a couple of their quilts. This was the first one they made. It was a gesture of friendship to the people of Lithuania and the old USSR. This one was presented in friendship to the people of Hiroshima, honoring those whose work has benefited survivors of the atomic blast. Each of these quilt blocks represents our good reasons for working together to avoid a nuclear war. This one was for Pete Seeger, for the musical threads that bound our lives together. Dr. Helen Caldecott was a recipient of this one because she was a founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility. This one almost looks 3D with the blocks. This was based on Soviet and American children's drawings and was quilted by both Soviet and American mothers. It was presented in person to the Leningrad Peace Committee as a symbol of the unity of mothers committed to a peaceful future for their children. This is really cool. It was in the early 1980s, all 100 US senators were asked to spend one night each beneath this quilt and then have their names embroidered on it. Ultimately, 67 quilters did so. I don't know how many of you know about a project known as the Ribbon Project, and this was one woman after she had gone to the Peace Memorial, Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum in Japan. She thought it would be a really great idea to create a mile-long ribbon which would wrap around the Pentagon and would serve to protest nuclear war. Well, this was her first panel on the left, embroidered with the names of loved ones. The ribbon grew into a huge project, which in August of 1985 wrapped around the Pentagon twice, across the bridge to the Pentagon, around the Capitol, around the the Washington Memorial, and around the reflecting pool, and there were still panels left over. Thousands and thousands of these panels were created by women. We actually went to this march is what happened is at a certain point, you tied every one of these banners was the same size, and each one represented what I do not want to lose in a nuclear war. And at a given point, all of the banners were tied together by the ribbons. You can see some were already lined up here. But on the right side here, that's actually my family. Shanna is in the stroller as we went to this, and it was really amazing. There were 27,000 panels. And I'm just going to skim through some of these very quickly so you can see the incredible. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's the picture of Sean in the stroller. The ribbon starts here. So these are an example of the incredible quilting art as well as other kinds of crafts that were represented. Somebody estimated that if they joined all these panels together, there would have been 17 miles of fabric. There's Shanna again. It's a 8-year-old looking at the panels. Chief Seattle, 1855. Your time of decay may be distant, but it will surely come. For even the white man, who is God, walked upon and talked with him as a friend to friend, cannot be exempt from this common destiny. We may be brothers after all. We will see. This was probably the largest collaborative craft event in American history. Now, another one that many of you are probably much more familiar with is the AIDS project, the NAMES project for the AIDS quilt. At that point, well over 5,000 panels had been made. And here's a picture of the Washington Mall with the panels laid out. That's so incredible to me to see something like that. I was not there present, but these pictures to me are just startling in their message and their beauty. These panels were all hand sewn to represent people who have died from AIDS. So this is kind of an interesting thing. In Jefferson County Correctional Center, men quilt every day as part of the center's restorative justice program. Again, we're talking here collaborative quilt projects made by more than one person or two people. These are also quilts made by inmates in a Missouri correctional facility. This one is really cool. This is not a quilt, but boy, it sure looks like a quilted building. This is created by the International Fiber Collective, and the materials included all forms of trash, adhesive decorations, and fibers. And the goal was to promote sustainable living through recycled art. Over 3,000 people around the world in 2008 created panels for this project. And it's an abandoned gas station. This is still going on today, the climate tree ribbon. In fact, many churches have actually created a real or artificial tree on their property where people can hang their ribbons with the hope for resolution of the climate crisis. This is a woman who began taking her son into New York City for cancer treatment, and she was struck by the number of homeless people. So she began sewing together old clothes in layers. And every time she went to New York, she would give away these sleeping bags. And so this became also a big collaborative project. The idea spread, and more than 100,000 ugly quilts, which is the name she gave them because of the mishmash of recycled fabrics, have been distributed. And so again, like the ribbon project and the Pink Pussy Hats project, this was the brainchild of one person, which brings us to those hats, famously crocheted, sewn, and knitted. It was the idea of just to women, and it spread all over the country. So if some of you marched in one of those sister marches or went to DC, you would have seen a sea of these hats. So hats were not the only thing. But I love this because they say, let's needle the politicians. We have to prod and goad them into action. So knitters and other craftivists felt so much frustration that the most intimate part of a woman's body is often a catchword for weakness. So they felt by taking back the word, they were exerting power over their own bodies. Now, I don't know if you live near enough Boston to have seen the ducklings, Mrs. Mallard, but even the ducklings were decked out with little hats for the Women's March. And there's the statue of Eleanor Roosevelt with her hat. Again, resistance knitted into this sweater, made into an outfit. Another collaborative quilt project. With the return of the popularity of the Handmaid's Tale, as women's rights to their own bodies have been under attack, women are often showing up with these handmade costumes and appearing in legislatures to make their point in silence. This is one of my favorite slides. I'm so angry I stitched this just so I could stab something 3,000 times. Another one, you cannot promote principled anti-corruption action without pissing off corrupt people. So some of you may or may not be familiar with the Tiny Pricks Project, and this was started by Diana Waymer, and she asked people to take words and phrases associated with Trump and embroider them, somehow get them into vintage textiles. And it was enormously popular. It's had thousands and thousands of people have now contributed to this, and it's actually toured the world. You can see some of the famous things. Kofefi, I'm a Stable Genius. So quilting bees, some of you are familiar with that concept, and actually it was a long history of activism in quilting bees, because women, especially prior to the women's suffrage movement, and then of course when they were organizing women's suffrage, they didn't have spaces, they couldn't vote, they didn't have spaces to really make their voices known, but they actually expressed a lot of that when they were talking around, because men weren't around, and they would just talk amongst themselves about what they wanted to do in terms of increasing their own financial independence and eventually ability to vote. So that would be called her story. So women have been denied a vote and an education, and sometimes even discouraged from writing. So quilts became their documents. Not many women wrote, but all sewed. And so quilts became expressive pieces that they could share their views with other people. So this is actually a quilt made by Susan B. Anthony when she was 15 years old. This is another old quilt. This is the only known quilt to date that pictorially depicts the issue of women's rights and suffrage before 1890. It's unusual in detail because in some of the blocks, a woman is driving to a women's rights rally and lecturing to a crowd, and a man is wearing an apron. Sojourner Truth, Ain't I a Woman? If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, women ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. Those are the words that are from her speech that are embroidered in the bottom of that quilt. This is another old one. This is a 1910 suffragette banner of the Women's Social and Political Union. And the women's names embroidered there are women who participated in the hunger strike. Interestingly, some suffragettes were not impressed with these needleworking efforts because they said, oh, quilts are the primary symbols of a woman's unpaid subjection. Another suffragette fundraising quilt, individuals paid to have their name embroidered in the quilt. This is a modern quilt, and the symbol for woman is created from circles of fabric surrounded by images of political buttons urging women's suffrage. Circuitous path that women had to follow, struggling for their rights. Another one. Hung out to dry. This quilt artist commemorated the women in her family who struggled and paved the way for her. So behind this central figure of a woman is a pyramid embroidered with words from the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. And the detail shows the suffragettes marching for votes for women. And you can actually see Wonder Woman is there in the lower right-hand corner. This is actually 2003, this quilt, and it was meant to encourage women to vote. That's actually called the Courthouse Steps Quilt Balk, representing the courts and the Constitution. Actually, in recent years, women running for office has topped 350%, and there are record numbers of women being elected. It's another quilt from Barbara Schulman, my friend, textile artist. This is her interpretation of Rosie the Riveter in multiple incarnations. So this is, of course, modern quilting. Famous women in the fight for women's rights, people like Dorothy Day, Gloria Steinem. Women rights are human rights. Now this one in the background is more like your traditional pieced quilt, but the letters on top make it make a bold statement. I've kind of a funny little story about my granddaughter Lila. When we went to see this exhibit, she was 7 and she wasn't supposed to go into the one room that said this is for adult supervision, but she did. She sneaked in there. And a couple of days later, we were riding in the car and Lila starts singing in the back seat, "My body, my choice, my pussy, my rules, my body, my right, my pussy, my rules." And Shanna unflappably says, "Oh, honey, where did you learn that song?" And Lila says, "The quilt show that Grammy took me to." So Hillary Clinton said in her 1995 speech to the UN, as long as discrimination and inequities remain commonplace everywhere in the world, as long as girls and women are valued less, fed last, overworked, underpaid, and not schooled, subjected in violence to inside and outside their homes, the potential of the human family to create a prosperous, peaceful world will not be realized. And this is according to Hillary Clinton's famous words in 2008, "Although we weren't able to shatter the highest, hardest glass ceiling this time, thanks to you, it's got about 18 million cracks in it." And notice that the biological symbol for the female gender has a peace sign in the center. I like this pun, Hillary quilt on. And the second quilt represents a dysfunctional Congress busy skirting the important issues. Rallying cry for all women and all underrepresented people. Applique over Sojourner Truth's words. Maternal mortality, being 3 times higher for Black women, African-American women. The one on the right is an American midwife. It was dedicated to women who have died in childbirth. So slavery and racism have also attracted a lot of quilters to express themes. This one represents the slave ship, Henrietta Marie. You can see the packing of the human bodies in the holds of the ships. This was a Quaker slavery quilt made by a woman whose home was on the Underground Railroad circuit. At the very center is a slave in chains and the words, "Deliver me from the oppression of man." You'll see a line down the middle of this quilt, and that is because the quilter's two great-granddaughters both wanted the quilt. So they did a King Solomon move. They cut it down the middle, and each of them took half, and eventually it was brought back together. U.S. Sanitary Commission. There were literally hundreds and hundreds of quilts made for soldiers. There's only 2 remaining quilts in the country that aren't in tatters. And the money was to support Civil War efforts. These are quite disturbing images. The flag, along with the lynching and the Jim Crow laws that obviously moved a lot of quilters. There was a quilt artist named LaShonda Storm who started the community-based Quilt Lynch Project, and this is one of her creations. There are over 7,500 blocks, and each one represents a person who died by lynching. The title "Strange Fruit" comes from a song by Billie Holiday. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Again, this one looks like a photograph almost, but again, they're quilted fabric. The bus ride that paved the way, and in the background you can see Barack Obama, Michelle, Martin Luther King, and Harriet Tubman. And then here's Rosa Parks. This commemorates the 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery, with up to 25,000 people crossing the Pettus Bridge, which is actually their 3rd attempt. Urban violence, the criminal justice system, the loss of a generation of young Black men, including Trayvon Martin. Eric Garner's death. Sean Kimber again, "I Can't Breathe." Mass incarceration. Many of the cells are filled with a disproportionate number of people of color. The first quilt's a tribute to the African-American farm workers who were exposed to pesticides while working in corporate farms. The second one is the African-American men who were subjected without their knowledge or consent to the 40-year Tuskegee study by the U.S. government, in which 600 men were deliberately infected with syphilis and remained untreated. This is Sean Kimber again. She takes these words from Eartha Kitt's autobiography. "In essence, I am a sophisticated cotton picker." Since most quilts are made of cotton fabric, obviously. More from her. "I am still not free." Since the expiration of the Voting Rights Act, the freedom to cast one's vote has become increasingly circumcised, particularly in areas where many Black and brown people live. Expressions in inequality. This is a really interesting one. Quilted into the sun and the rainbow circles are the words, "You are a racist." If you look really carefully, you can see some of those letters. The words are hard to see because of the phenomenon known as white privilege is difficult to acknowledge. Shut up and listen. White silence is violence. Two different quilts. What Black America wants white America to know. So this is like so many issues, not enough fabric. So some of the issues that we have covered and some of the ones that are in the quilts are listed there. And one needle at a time, one quilt piece at a time, raising social justice. The fabric can absorb the pain and the needle can guide the way through the process, moving toward healing. And so, given the press of time, what I'm going to do is just flip through these, just to give you an example of some of the different quilts from around the world that are representing some of these different issues. This, by the way, this quilt is made up of fabric from people who died trying to cross into the United States in the desert. It's internment. Native peoples. So every one of these quilts has a story. Apartheid. Children separated from their parents during the Holocaust. This is interesting because there's the Jewish star on the left, but also in the quilt on the right, the star is, the yellow star is in the background created with the fabric. That's the Boston Marathon bombing. Two trauma surgeons who worked on this quilt made many stitches and then tied them off just like they do in surgery. The one on the left is created from different kinds of trash, basically, that people who are homeless try to use to create some warmth. Plastic bags, corrugated cardboard, used tarps, and newspaper. Domestic abuse. This one is actually a very sad quilt, childhood trauma. It's through the eyes of an abused child. It's difficult because the players keep getting pushed back to the start over and over again. So, ending with a little bit of hope. Hope, resist, give rise to your concerns. This is Sean Kimber's meditation on missing Obama. Mandala's clan name was Mandiba. When Bishop Desmond Tutu was presented with this quilt, he said, "I'm acutely aware of the number of artists who have contributed to the quilt. It's a collective action on the behalf of human rights by so many textile artists that I believe captures the essence of our humanity." This is a really fascinating woman to learn about. She's a young lady who has started the Social Justice Sewing Academy so that people can give voice to people they have lost, loved ones, to violence and gun violence. There's actually a chapter in at the Lowell Museum, New England Quilt Museum, if any of you are quilters and want to get involved in that. Silence is not an option. Reverend Martin Luther King, there comes a time when silence is betrayal. The truth must be told. We will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, silence in the face of evil itself is evil. Not to speak is to, not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. So social activists believe when we see something or hear something that's unjust, we have a responsibility to challenge it until fairness is achieved. Resist at every turn, disrupt, make noise, work for the power of the good. And how do you do that? Well, one way is to contact your representatives, of course, and I know probably most of you already know that and do that. Take a number, call your representative. Quilters and activists don't give up. They take up their needle, they work at the pattern. Life is like that, and so is social justice. One stitch at a time, patiently, the pattern will come out. All right, like the embroidery. I want to stitch as a reflection of our past, using recycled materials, and as a medium for addressing political and social issues. I want to stitch 1,000 white teepees as a testament to love, not war. Thoughts that lie too deep for tears. Quilts that stimulate my peers. Quilts that keep the homeless warm, that bring back memories when I am gone. So a lot of the information in this presentation I took from this book, Quilts and Human Rights, which is a wonderful book with many illustrations. And they say the book is dedicated to all of those who use their needles to express their experiences with human rights injustices and to prick the conscience of others in calls for awareness and action. And so that's it. That's the end. I'm sorry I went a little bit over, but it's hard. There's so much material. So thank you for allowing me to share with you two of my passions, quilting and social justice.
Great. Oh, thank you very much, Nancy. That was very informative.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate Jeff and John, the work that both of you did to set this up.
Okay, great. We'll see you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.